I'm Hadar Hazony,
And I'm Titus Techera.
and this is Transvaluation, a series of conversations dedicated to Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil.
Okay, so today we're doing round four. We're doing the middle section of chapter one. We're starting at aphorism 10. We'll be dealing with the criticism of modern philosophy and modern science after his criticism of ancient philosophy, especially the Stoics, in aphorism 9. Okay, Hadar.
Aphorism 10. The eagerness and subtlety, I might even say shrewdness, with which the problem of the real and the apparent world is today attacked all over Europe makes one think and wonder, and anyone who hears nothing in the background except a will to truth certainly does not have the best of ears. In rare and isolated instances, it may really be the case that such a will to truth, some extravagant and adventurous courage, a metaphysician's ambition to hold a hopeless position, may participate and ultimately prefer even a handful of certainty to a whole carload of beautiful possibilities. There may actually be puritanical fanatics of conscience who prefer even a certain nothing to an uncertain something to lie down on and die. But this is nihilism and the sign of a despairing, mortally weary soul, however courageous the gestures of such a virtue may look. It seems, however, to be otherwise with stronger and livelier thinkers who are still eager for life. When they side against appearance and speak of perspective with a new arrogance, when they rank the credibility of their own bodies about as low as the credibility of the visual evidence that the earth stands still, and thus, apparently in good humor, let their securest possessions go. For in what does one at present believe more firmly than in one's body? Who knows if they are not trying at bottom to win back something that was formerly an even securer possession, something of the ancient domain of faith of former times, perhaps the immortal soul, perhaps the old God, in short, ideas by which one could live better, that is to say, more vigorously and cheerfully, than by modern ideas. There is mistrust of these modern ideas in this attitude, a disbelief in all that has been constructed yesterday and today. There is perhaps some slight admixture of satiety and scorn, unable to endure any longer the bric-a-brac of concepts of the most diverse origin, which is the form in which so-called positivism offers itself on the market today. A disgust of the most fastidious taste at the village fair modeliness and the patchiness of all these reality philosophasters, in whom there is nothing new or genuine, except this modeliness. In this, it seems to me, we should agree with these skeptical anti-realists and knowledge microscopists of today. Their instinct, which repels them from modern reality, is unrefuted. What do their retrograde bypaths concern us? The main thing about them is not that they wish to go back, but that they wish to get away, a little more strength, flight, courage, and artistic power, and they would want to rise, not return.
So this is the first aphorism that you could say speaks directly to the kinds of problems intellectuals face today, the kind of rejection of the odd intellectualism of modern life, especially on the right, and looking for something more vital or vigorous on the one hand, or something of a higher order, spiritually more powerful on the other hand. And so I'm sure people will be paying close attention to how Nietzsche looks at the problem. The first thing is his typical hermeneutics of suspicion, to repeat a well-worn phrase. Why are people this way? It's not the will to truth. There may be a few of these people left, a few metaphysicians, a few nihilists, but they're not what counts, because they do not give to the time its dramatic character. Those people, however, are important because there is something of the noble about them. Nietzsche doesn't entirely dismiss them because he does admit there's something that seems courageous in the rejection of modern ideas. in the attempt to hold on to old teachings. That is to say, in the attempt to withstand the revolution in thought operated by modern philosophy and modern science on its back. And since there's a kind of backwardness, a kind of rearguard action in these people, that's notable. It's the best sign of the transition occurring. But if, on the other hand, you look at this position from its own inner structure by its own standards, Nietzsche looks at it and says that's just nihilism. These people have given up. They're no longer capable of withstanding the shocks of being. And so that's the criticism he makes. As useful as they are to notice in understanding what's happening to thinking and thinkers, they're not useful for dealing with it. And instead, he turns to this other category, the stronger, livelier thinkers, and that is to say, those who are still eager for life. And they share in common with the metaphysicians a kind of rejection of appearances of the phenomena, and therefore a kind of rejection of modern science, which is all about the phenomena. And after all, this is what the studies show, the phenomena. And this rejection, Nietzsche interprets as a sign of higher character, of a search for nobility. The problem with modern ideas is that on the one hand, they seem quite paltry, and on the other hand, they don't seem to have any coherence. There's, in a way, it's too easy to have enlightenment. Enlightenment will be sold to you by every kind of sophist you can think of, and therefore you end up with this vulgarity of ideas. And it suddenly becomes obvious, maybe embarrassingly obvious, maybe shockingly obvious, that neither is man as man a whole, since there are a million different things to look at, a million different facts to know, nor is society a whole, since there are all these different schools of sophistry that sell enlightenment of this aspect or of that aspect. And there is something boring, there's something wearying about it. It's, so to speak, so much nothing. And therein lies the danger. To pair love of life and study, you would have to give an account of human activity and maybe eventually of history in a coherent way, but nevertheless a way that leaves room for human beings to act. And that's somehow Nietzsche's project, but it is not clear how that could be done on the basis of the modern science, which would seem to do away with being human in the first place. But on the other hand, in Nietzsche's analysis, it seems to presuppose still all of the metaphysical thoughts that were inherited from the historical tradition. And so he will have to find some way to reconcile these two problems here. He wants to adopt modern science and indeed radicalize it, but in another way, he wants to clean up its act by making obvious and attacking the presuppositions that are still embedded in scientific thought, or that pretend to the character of scientific thought, but are nothing but sophistry. The old basis on which various things were considered, the old philosophical arguments, have been wiped out, but their leftovers are now somehow useful to various kinds of sophists. It offers some kind of comfort to people. And that is for Nietzsche intolerable. It's so to speak the worst of both worlds. It's modern without being daring, and it is traditional without having any kind of courage or piety. Instead, he would like to lead these kinds of livelier spirits to look at themselves, to come to know in themselves why are they rejecting modern ideas. It's not because they're that traditional. It's not because they're enamored of the old ways. It's because there is a sense in them of what is noble that is somehow more clearly identified with the old, partly because the new things are so embarrassing. Those people, however, have to come to see themselves as in need of reestablishing that possibility of life, the life that had for itself a kind of confidence, vigor, cheer, as he says in this aphorism, but to reestablish that on a new basis. So you could say that this kind of audience is a privileged audience for Nietzsche. It has something to do with what he means by a philosophy of the future, that is a way to marry the science in the strict sense with nobility in the strict sense. And nobility is of course, the concern of the last chapter of Beyond Good and Evil, and science is the concern of the first chapter. So somehow it's the work as a whole that he gives you some insight into in this aphorism. The last thing I'll say about the aphorism has to do with the way in which he disaggregates and reaggregates, in a way that separates motive from argument and then puts them back together. You'd have to think about why, if he takes these two types of anti-realists, on the one hand, the livelier, more in love with life people, and on the other hand, the weary, mortally wounded souls. They seem to the ordinary man to be the same kind of person. Anti-enlightenment, anti-modernism, they're despisers of precisely what they have inherited from modernity, belief in the body and nothing but the body. All is matter in motion, and then you could be even more philosophical or skeptical by denying the reality of the body too. You wonder, what the hell are you left with? There are two ways of looking at it for Nietzsche. One of them is you'd end up with nihilism. And the other one is you would be able to look at life again with fresh eyes. He's willing to take the risk of taking the side of these proud younger people who are against enlightenment, because he thinks they could be guided by their instinct for life if they receive the right teaching into regarding life properly. They see that somehow the account of life given in modern science is too contemptible to take seriously. But they don't see that they do need an account of life, that is to say, a scientific account. You can't simply reject enlightenment, even if you reject what is so obviously wrong with it. But you would have to somehow find the content of human activity explained in such a way that it spurs on human activity, or it improves human activity, rather than in such a way as that it makes human beings unnecessary or impossible. Human beings would be unnecessary if there's a kind of scientific determinism that you could say could reduce you, say, to your hormones, or could reduce you to whatever other biological reality. And on the other hand, human being could be, simply impossible if the account of matter or physics, so to speak, is fully successful. Modern science is a science that does not have room for human beings. The physicist is not part of the objects of modern physics. In fact, he is being destroyed by them, so to speak. And this is the problem that Nietzsche believes he can solve. And this is the audience for whom he believes this can present itself as a problem. Because if you don't feel it's a problem, if you don't want to reject this kind of enlightenment, why would you even care about what Nietzsche has to offer?
Yeah. Yeah, these few aphorisms that we're going to read, including aphorism number 10, are quite challenging, as we were discussing before the recording, that they're quite challenging because Nietzsche is referencing all kinds of conversations and debates that are happening in philosophy in the 100, 200 years before him, but he doesn't really make the effort to explain to us what these debates are. And for someone who is not schooled in these debates, not familiar with German idealism and the debates in German philosophy at the time, it can be very confusing to understand who he's talking about. And in the previous aphorisms, he at least names either particular ancient philosophers or schools of philosophy like Stoicism, and it gives you more of a sense of who he's attacking. And here he really doesn't, and you have to reconstruct it. This whole discussion of the real and the apparent world, quote unquote, uh, I think he's attacking here the students of Kant, the students of Hegel, this struggle to find some equilibrium between in this notion that perhaps there is a divergence or a difference between the real world and the world that we perceive. And the reason why he, as you so eloquently put it, thinks this leads to nihilism is because if you feel that you're trapped in a world of appearances that aren't real, and that there's some other world which is real, that will disvalue the appearances to you, and you will feel like everything you're experiencing is valueless because it's not real. And indeed, after Kant, there begins uh, a real question of whether we even have any access to the real world. So, at least in the Platonic version of this real apparent distinction, there is such an access. But post Kant, really post Hume, that becomes a live question. Like, do we have any real interaction with the objective reality, or are these all just appearances which are distortions, or perhaps not even distortions? Perhaps they're completely divorced from the real. And so, on the one hand, as you said, Nietzsche says there is something courageous about clinging to this rational philosophical exploration of the relationship between reality and perception, uh, even though it is leading us to the conclusion that one cannot apprehend reality, that you don't have any interaction with the real. And perhaps there is something courageous about this suicidal will to truth, which will pursue the logical conclusions of philosophy, despite the fact that it is undoing the world in which you live. However, that is by definition nihilism. And so that road appears close to Nietzsche simply because it turns against life, as we had discussed in the previous aphorisms. And then he gets to this question of modern science, which appears to be a different path. It's a path that doesn't necessarily disvalue the things that we're experiencing, and it tries to take them as real objects in some sense or another. But it does so through this view of perspective. Uh, modern science tries not to say things about the underlying metaphysical nature of the phenomena, as you were saying. It tries not to explain how the laws of physics came to be, right? It is sufficient to simply say that these are the laws of physics. This is how we measure them. They work in this manner or this pattern. And the modern scientist will not deign, or I should say, he's too humble to try to say, well, why were the laws of physics made? By who were they made? For what purpose were they made? What purpose should they serve us? What is the purpose of life? These things he will not pursue. And in a sense, he thinks that makes him more modest. In a sense, he thinks that means that he is not making the same grandiose claims of certainty that the old scholastic metaphysicians would have. Right? He is not making arguments that a religious theologian would have made about the purpose of the world or how it was created. And even it appears that he's willing to relinquish his certainty of his own body. But Nietzsche says, well, but there's something going on here underneath the surface. There's a certain kind of bait and switch happening where we're pretending to be skeptical, but in reality, we're smuggling in the immortal soul and the old God. We're bringing back certainty because we say, oh, well, we don't know how the universe was created. We don't know the purpose of life. And we don't aspire to say anything about those things. But we still hold on to this supposed certainty of the physical phenomena, of the scientific theorems, as if these things are certain, right? And they become this new kind of idol. They become a new form of the bedrock of analysis, which then is not questioned. And its effects on us are not questioned. its purposes are not questioned. So then, as you were saying, science becomes this self-referential thing which legitimates itself and gives value to itself. It justifies itself, right? But science cannot justify itself. Doing science, I think you were talking about this in our previous episode, doing science for the sake of science does not explain to anyone why science should be pursued. It doesn't even really explain what the value of science for life is, other than we can conclude that doing science is better for life than, say, doing metaphysics, which undermines our ability to believe in reality, right? So, in that sense, maybe science is conducive to life. But for what kind of life? It does not grant us an ability to evaluate the high life versus the low life. And so, in that sense, yes, Nietzsche is accepting this movement towards perspectivism, and he is accepting this move away from the reality and appearance distinction, which he does think we need to overcome. And we're going to see that in the next aphorism, that even engaging in the whole debate about the distinction between reality and appearance for Nietzsche is a waste of time and bad for life. But we still need to go one stage further, right? It is not sufficient to get away, right? It is necessary to rise, because and that's the real crux of the matter, which we keep coming back to, which is that modernity gives us two possibilities. We're going to get away from the old world one way or another, but one way to get away is down, right? That is also a way, right? We can deteriorate both philosophically and as life forms. And so Nietzsche is trying to give a directionality to this away motion, to this rejection, to this criticism. And he says, well, if we're going to critique philosophy, then we should do it in a manner which goes up.
Yeah, and this is what is at issue. Is knowledge possible? Is knowledge good? We no longer have a right to take that for granted, but we assume it nevertheless. But we begin to have a bad conscience about it. We begin to have suspicions about it, that there's some kind of contradiction between our method of science, which implies science is possible, maybe even easy, and certainly good for us, and our theory, which is that we should not have teleological presumptions. We can't talk about the finality of things, and therefore we can't say that there's any providence. And so the more we advance in the results of science, the more we have undermined the confidence in which science presupposes that science is good, because knowledge is possible and it's good. And so we could say that it's an entirely self-undermining project. But Nietzsche thinks he can rescue it. And again, it's somehow he set himself the task to rescue modern science, not simply to jettison it. That's maybe the most remarkable thing about Nietzsche.
Aphorism 11. It seems to me that today attempts are made everywhere to divert attention from the actual influence Kant exerted on German philosophy, and especially to ignore prudently the value he set upon himself. Kant was first and foremost proud of his table of categories. With that in his hand, he said, "This is the most difficult thing that could ever be undertaken on behalf of metaphysics." Let us only understand this could be. He was proud of having discovered a new faculty in man, the faculty for synthetic judgments a priori. Suppose he deceived himself in this matter. The development and rapid flourishing of German philosophy depended nevertheless on his pride, and on the eager rivalry of the younger generation to discover, if possible, something still prouder, at all events, new faculties. But let us reflect. It is high time to do so. How are synthetic judgments a priori possible? Kant asked himself. And what really is his answer? by virtue of a faculty, which is in German Vermöge eines Vermögens, right? By faculty of a faculty. But unfortunately, not in 5 words, but so circumstantially, venerably, and with such a display of German profundity and curlicues that people simply failed to note the comical Näsere Allemand involved in such an answer. People were actually beside themselves with delight over this new faculty, and the jubilation reached its climax when Kant further discovered a moral faculty in man. For at that time, the Germans were still moral and not yet addicted to realpolitik.
So here you get a sense of how modernity worked. Nietzsche is, of course, especially interested in Germany. He was German, but more importantly, he lived in a time when German thought dominated what we call the world. You could say that somewhere from Goethe until the Weimar years, German thought dominated the world, and it had a strange reach. The scientists turned out to be mostly German well into the 20th century, but so also the musicians, and it's not immediately obvious why that should be so, at least not on the basis of modern thought. And so with any number of other things. But above all, the philosophers were German. And since the modern philosophers had not been German, from Machiavelli, move on to France, England, or as Nietzsche mentioned, Spinoza, there was even this renegade Jewish guy in the Netherlands, but not German philosophers at that time. Maybe the first one is Leibniz, but at any rate, at that point, not important. It was only with Kant that German philosophers dominated philosophy. And in a way, put an end to it. So all of this ends with Nietzsche and Heidegger. So the context of philosophy, however, has something to do with the people. There was a time when the Germans were young as a people, and they had the innocence of their morality. This was before, as he says, they became addicted to realpolitik, as they did in his own day. Nietzsche famously or infamously renounced his Prussian citizenship. He was apatrid, a stateless creature, which these things don't exist now really, and certainly did not then. He did not like the Germany of realpolitik, not because he was exactly against realpolitik, but he thought there was something paltry about it. Nietzsche did not think that the Kaiser or even Bismarck were really conducting politics on a grand scale, that they were building a great civilization. And he was against this. He thought that the Germans should be properly educated and therefore become an imperial people. He didn't think it was happening. So that's the context on Nietzsche's opinion about all of this, and that's important because what he's describing in this section is how far and how fast Germany changed, and the continuity to the extent that there is a continuity in that century of German transformation from this Prussia to the imperial regime is Kant. After the crisis of the mid-19th century, Germany returned to Kant with what is known as Neo-Kantianism, which was still thriving in the early part of the 20th century. It still has an enormous influence, say, over law, positivism in law, especially in Europe, but not exclusively. The pure theory of law, Hans Kelsen, things like that. All of that is Neo-Kantianism. But also in sociology, this kind of sociology comes from Max Weber, who is half Nietzsche and half Kant, which is a kind of a monstrous mix. But it's just an enormous influence. It's hard to describe how important he was. But Nietzsche is the first man to indict Kant as somehow the catastrophe of German philosophy. And therefore to point out, first of all, that Kant intended for himself to get the greatest reputation, get the highest honors. Kant talks of himself in a way which is typical of modern philosophers as an enemy of metaphysics. They all say that. This is what Nietzsche says, Heidegger after him, or Husserl, but before Kant and Hegel, every other modern philosopher, they're always attacking metaphysics. This is what they do. But Kant is the one to say that he has more than that actually rescued philosophy. He has overcome the problem that philosophy seemed like it was coming to an end with David Hume, who denied that there's causality, and therefore there is no knowledge in the strict sense. why a being is what it is and how it is such that it cannot be in any other way, what makes it intelligible and what it is no longer possible if you don't have a study of causality. And Hume is the first to draw the conclusion that if you follow from the premises of matter in motion of modern thought, you must eventually abandon really rationalism. That you could say is the dead end of empiricism, and Kant saved thought and civilization, as he thought, from that problem. This is why he was so proud, but only Nietzsche is there to look at it and say, partly because the game is up, it's over. Now it's kind of obvious what enormous arrogance this was and what it inspired on the other hand. Crazy as the thought is, it made it possible for all of these Germans to start being thinkers. Kant introduced, that is to say, idealism. He told people secretly that the power of thought is enormous. Yes, everybody's scared of modern science, which is all about matter in motion, all about determinism. It denies that you are human or that you even exist. It would seem to reduce to mere delusion any inner state or inner experience, or what used to be called soul. But fear not, idealism is in the wings. And that is why Nietzsche insists on this specific aspect of Kant, the synthetic judgments a priori. Now, say that the table of the categories of understanding stands to the Kantian theory of science as the organon to the metaphysics of Aristotle. That is, the organon, the treatise on logic, makes it possible to inquire into being, which is an unusually difficult thing, and it's the topic of metaphysics. But also in Kant, thinking about the categories of understanding and thinking about the kinds of judgments makes it possible to identify what specifically is philosophical or thought of the highest, most fertile character. Now, a judgment, predicating a predicate of a subject, a judgment is either analytic or synthetic, and it is either a priori or a posteriori for Kant. Analytic judgments are those that merely say what inheres in a subject, like saying that the human being has 2 eyes, 2 hands, 2 feet. It's simply implied. You're just spelling out something that was already there. A synthetic judgment is one that establishes a truth that is new, something that was not simply implied in the subject. And of course, that is absolutely necessary if there's going to be any progress in science. And then judgments are either a posteriori or a priori, depending on whether they depend on experience or are pure, i.e. purely rational. So it is possible to have judgments that are synthetic a posteriori, and that's what primarily we call positivism in the sciences. We learn new things from the sciences and then make new things. So they are synthetic, they add something new, they put things together in a way they had not been put before, but they are all a posteriori, they are all given in experience. And therefore they cannot ground themselves. For there to be a ground of science, of philosophy, of new knowledge, there would have to be synthetic judgments a priori, things that the pure mind can achieve, and therefore show the power of the mind over matter. This is why this is so important. It was so stimulating to such a moralistic race as the Germans then were, according to Nietzsche. That's how it proved that, it's possible to think your way, so to speak, out of the modern problem. And the jubilation, of course, reaches its peak when Kant, so to speak, reverses modern philosophy as a whole and says morality actually counts more than science. Metaphysics just doesn't achieve that much, rationality just doesn't achieve that much, but moral reasoning based on the idea of freedom, that is the way in which the human being asserts its humanity precisely against the nature that is described very adequately, but horrifyingly, by modern science. That is practical reason. That is the peak of humanity. And then the crowd goes wild. Somehow, in one fell swoop, Kant has asserted that the mind is somehow sovereign over nature, the domain of science, and has saved morality also from the fear that since all is matter in motion, human beings are also nothing but matter in motion. Says, no, there is a reign of freedom, a realm of freedom outside of nature. And this leads to crazy town, Nietzsche says. But on the other hand, it got everybody going. It is the arrogance, the pride, the self-importance of Kant that tells you what the Germans really were like as a people. He somehow instantiates them in a way nobody's quite willing to admit or even recognize. And that's because they have to believe in what he's saying, as opposed to admitting that they just want it to be true because it'll make them feel important.
Yeah, his cynicism about the Germans never ceases to amaze. It just comes out over and over and over again. Yeah, I mean we don't have to go. I mean, you gave a very good brief uh, introduction to the Kantian question, and we don't have to go too deep into it. After all, we are discussing Nietzsche. Um, but one of the challenging things about Nietzsche is that he both attacks and accepts many things in Kant without ever really telling you. He just does. And if you haven't read Kant, that can make it very confusing. For example, he uses this term, the thing in itself, right? This the thing behind this veil that our senses cannot penetrate. Nietzsche uses this euphemism often, sometimes to reference God, sometimes to reference articles of faith. Sometimes he uses it scientifically. But he never tells you what he's discussing or why, and he doesn't even tell you he's referencing Kant. He simply does. And it's just a little bit similar to the way he references art, where oftentimes he will reference a painter, he will reference an author, a, a play, and he won't tell the story. He won't describe the painting. He simply will reference it, and he just assumes that you're cultured and that you know what he's talking about. And if you don't, then you're an ignoramus, and he doesn't care. So it creates a certain barrier of entry. I think sufficient for us, aside of the very good introduction that you presented, is to say that Kant was trying to solve a problem that, as you noted, emerges with Hume, that appears to indicate that our senses and the empirical information that we gather from our senses cannot be rationally, philosophically used to prove that there is a reality outside of our senses. Right? We're trapped in our own bodies. We're trapped in the sense experience that we're receiving, and we don't know. We don't have any verification that this empirical data actually references reality, which seems to make all thought impossible. Because if you can't know that the information you're getting is correct, then how can you know that the thoughts you're having about the information are correct? So it's this kind of a cutting off of the human mind from the world, from life. This kind of circumcision of the mind, if you will. And what happens is that Kant alleges that he has solved this problem. Right? The claim is that Kant saved the world, Kant saved philosophy, because he found out how we overcome this apparent chasm or infinite separation between the human experience and the objective reality. And without going too deep into it, that bridge that Kant creates is certain certain concepts that he thinks have to be true for us to be able to have thoughts. Right? So they're like preconditions for thinking. And if you look at thoughts, you think about thoughts, you might never prove that those thoughts correspond directly to objects outside of thought, to the real world, to actual experience. Maybe you can't do that. But what you can prove is that thoughts happen and work in such a way that they must be based on a certain set of rules. And those rules are objectively true. Because if they weren't true, we wouldn't be having thoughts in the first place. It's a little bit similar to Descartes' I think, therefore I am. It's not identical, it's much more complex, but there is some similarity to that mode of thinking or that direction in pursuit of objective truth. And here, Nietzsche does not argue against this view. He doesn't disprove it. He simply says, how are these things possible? How is it possible that there are such concepts which prove that our thoughts are real. And he deduces, but really he is making fun of Kant. He says, well, really for Kant, it's a faculty by virtue of a faculty. How do you know that your brain has concepts that must be true? Because your brain has concepts, so they must be true, right? It's a tautology, right? It's circular logic. But nevertheless, as you pointed out, this was explosive in Germany because it allowed people to say, well, yes, all this new information is coming in from the sciences, and it significantly undermines the way that we used to live our lives and all the rules that we used to live by, and religion and the faith, the historical faith, and traditions. All these things are being undermined by science. But we have morality, and morality stems for Kant from these objectively true concepts. And so morality kind of flies above science, right? It is even more real than science. Anything that we get from science is in a sense suspect or insufficiently real compared to morality, which is infinitely real. And Nietzsche says on multiple occasions, this is just a smuggling of Christianity back into the moral world. And Nietzsche thought that the Germans were the most Christian of peoples. And in his view, this is a kind of moralizing. The reason why the Germans were so excited about Kant's synthetic judgments a priori is because it allowed them to be both very modern on the one hand and put on airs that they were independent of all that, Middle Ages and all the, old world superstitions and all that stuff, but at the same time to be puritanically moral in a Christian sense or from a Christian perspective, and to preserve and perpetuate all these previous judgments and valuations and prejudices that they already had, right? And this issue of being youthful is that at that time they were sufficiently arrogant and sufficiently young to not understand that this is what they were doing, that they were just projecting themselves on modernity, right? They simply were moral. They had these moral instincts and moral valuations, and they were looking for an excuse to, to project themselves onto modernity, and that was the result. But of course, none of this was built on solid ground.
Yeah, with Kant, with transcendental idealism, you get to eat your enlightenment and have it too. You get to have all of the science without any of the immorality that was typical of, say, if you read Hobbes or Spinoza or what have you, Descartes, Locke, right? To say nothing of Machiavelli, it's just too horrifying for decent people. Now, philosophy has, in a certain sense, been domesticated and is the ally of morality, and this obviously Nietzsche can't stand that thought.
Good. The honeymoon of German philosophy arrived. All the young theologians of the Tübingen seminary went into the bushes, all looking for faculties. And what did they not find? In that innocent, rich, and still youthful period of the German spirit, to which Romanticism, the malignant fairy, piped and sang, when one could not yet distinguish between finding and inventing. Above all, a faculty for the suprasensible. Schelling christened it intellectual intuition, and thus gratified the most heartfelt cravings of the Germans, whose cravings were at bottom pious. One can do no greater wrong to the whole of this exuberant and enthusiastic movement, which was really youthfulness, however boldly it disguised itself in hoary and senile concepts, than to take it seriously, or worse, to treat it with moral indignation. Enough. One grew older, and the dream vanished. A time came when people scratched their heads, and they still scratch them today. One had been dreaming, and first and foremost, old Kant. By virtue of a faculty, he had said, or at least meant. But is that an answer? An explanation? Or is it not rather merely a repetition of the question? How does opium induce sleep? By the virtue of a faculty, namely the virtus domativa, replies the doctor in Molière. I'm not going to attempt to read this Latin, because it contains a sleepy faculty whose nature it is to put the senses to sleep. Obviously a tautology. But such replies belong in comedy, and it is a high time to replace the Kantian question, how are synthetic judgments a priori possible, by another question, Why is belief in such judgments necessary? And to comprehend that such judgments must be believed to be true for the sake of the preservation of creatures like ourselves, though they might, of course, be false judgments for all that. Or, to speak more clearly and coarsely, synthetic judgments a priori should not be possible at all. We have no right to them. In our mouths, they are nothing but false judgments. Only, of course, the belief in their truth is necessary as a foreground belief and visual evidence belonging to the perspective optics of life. Finally, to call to mind the enormous influence that German philosophy, quote unquote, I hope you understand its right to quotation marks, has exercised throughout the whole of Europe, there is no doubt that a certain virtus domativa had a share in it. It was a delight to the noble idlers, the virtuous, the mystics, artists, three-quarter Christians, and political obscurantists of all nations to find, thanks to German philosophy, an antidote to the still predominant sensualism which overflowed from the last century into this, in short, sensus assupere, putting the senses to sleep.
And so here at the end of aphorism 11, you see two very important judgments to Nietzsche. The Germans are too much on the pious side, they're too self-important, and the consequence of that is they lack a certain taste for radicalism. The German does not like ugly truths. He would like the truth to be moral, as he says here. The French are the opposite. The French like the ugly truths, and this is why Nietzsche likes to quote French, to use French remarks. Here it's Moliere's comedy, right? The La Malade Imaginaire, the fellow who thinks himself sick, hypochondriac, I guess we would say today. The mockery of the old Aristotelian, Thomistic, medieval scholastic science that was preserved in the old-fashioned doctors. It is that morality and philosophy that is attacked by Molière, and Nietzsche applauds it. He likes, to a certain extent, the French better than the Germans because they were more sensualist, they were more immoralist. And with this taste for ugly truth came, he says, a taste for life. And that's a very important thing to think about in terms of French and German thought of an earlier and the later modernity. The later modernity was really all about Kant and his followers restoring morality to its rightful place as they saw it in the order of thought. And that's another way of putting the fact that they wanted to get everything they could get out of Christianity without any of the Christianity. They wanted to prove that on an atheistic basis of modern science, you could achieve all of this morality. And in this way, Hume is not different. It might sound crazy, but the Hume who says, well, causation, is it even a thing? Is also the Hume who says, think about how nice we are. Think about how moral we are. Think about our sympathy. This is, again, maybe shocking to people today, or perhaps not so shocking among liberal Americans who are sort of in that vein. But ordinarily, it would be regarded as shocking. So there was this deep desire to moralize philosophy and, in a way, to moralize society and get rid of religion. And you could say that that continues the modern project of, say, Hobbes' Leviathan, of Descartes. You want to recreate all of society. And previously, philosophy had recreated political science with Hobbes, Locke, etc. It had recreated natural science with Bacon, Descartes, etc. But it had not recreated morality. And in a way, it had to, because modern political science separates the state from society. And if the state is the domain of Hobbes, you can say that society is left somehow out of account. And so it is necessary to take that over. You see the reasonableness of Christianity already with Locke, but it is Kant who says religion within the limits of reason alone, right? That takeover, religion for atheists, that ended up describing the 19th century, and it is what led to the blow-up of philosophy. He mentions Schelling, but there were a bunch of these people in the idealist vein of German philosophy. He mentions the Romantics, who attacked rationalism for its inhumanity. It cannot account for the inner state of the soul. Nietzsche praises the subjectivism and the skepticism of modern philosophy, but he points out that they point in a way in radically different directions. The subjectivism certainly points to something like romanticism, absolute idealism, Schelling. There must be an absolute affirmation of the I somehow. And that will be mere perspectivism, but it must be at least that. And so it's not possible to be skeptical of that. A kind of rationalist skepticism, as you mentioned with Descartes, dubito ergo cogito. The cogito is about the world. The dubito is about the cogito. It's interior to thought itself. It's like the relationship between reason and intellect in Kant's system. It's transcendental. It is within the human mind as such, not dependent on experience. That's why it's so important. That's why it's so powerful, as you were saying. But that retreat into the subject also makes the subject very vulnerable to this kind of 19th century rationalism, as did the expansion of philosophy into society to replace religion. All of a sudden, all the religious longings became part of the task of philosophy to deal with. And this is how, in the short century, if you think about it, Kant's Critique of Reason appears in 1781. By 1885, Nietzsche is writing Beyond Good and Evil, an eventful century. Everything had blown up by Nietzsche's time, and so he has the satisfaction of looking back on these things and making fun of them. Half of them happened in his own lifetime. I mean, he was born in 1844. It's remarkable what a compressed modern history this aspect of rationalist, moralistic enlightenment has. It's amazing how fast Germany went through this whole passage from enlightenment to realpolitik, which is, you could say, pure cynicism. And nevertheless, only Nietzsche would point and say, look to Kant. He did this. He promised people so much, encouraged them to go so far. And they were so excited about it, and they did so much, and look at the consequences. They never saw where it would go because they didn't realize what drove them. And hence, in the second half of 11, he says, don't worry so much about the truth of the synthetic a priori judgments. There is no truth to it. We don't have that much knowledge. We just don't. Look instead to why people need to believe it. And when he mocks with Molière the false philosophy, he says, well, that's a comedy. He wants another kind of answer. Maybe that then would be a tragedy, is what he's looking for. Maybe the way he tells the story is a melding in a way of comedy and tragedy. He makes fun with Molière of Kant, of the modern philosophers, not just of the scholastics, but he also adds a tragic bent to this. Look at what happened. Germany ending up from Friedrich the Great to Kaiser Wilhelm, this is not progress. This is a catastrophe. And he points out that that's happened to thought as well. Kant has not led through Kantianism to any of the progress that you might have expected. It has led to the catastrophe of philosophy. Philosophy and politics have both reached this enormous peak and collapsed in Germany in his lifetime. And that's why it's so interesting. And that also means, therefore, that there was something wrong with that thought. It promised so much progress, but actually, as he says, it put people to sleep. It gave them so much of what they thought they wanted about moralizing thought and moralizing society through the power of thought, of enlightenment, of propaganda, of the modern state, right? That they stopped thinking about it. They built this enormous engine of progress and never asked themselves, A, does it deliver progress? And B, will we survive?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bleak picture, but it's funny that he says, you know, the worst thing would be to take them seriously. And I once had a debate with somebody about this passage. He really doesn't go into why it's not possible to have these Kantian concepts as synthetic judgments a priori. He doesn't take on Schelling. He doesn't take on Hegel. He doesn't engage in their debate. He's standing outside of the debate. And on the one hand, he says the entire belief in this thing is a kind of youth. Later, he'll call it a master morality. It's a projection, it's a kind of faith. And ultimately, in old age, experience uh, or a lack of strength will eventually lead it to decay. And now it has decayed. And now that it is decaying, we have woken up. We can tell that it was a dream, that it was a projection. His attack of Kant is the same attack that the early moderns had of Aristotle, as you said. It's tautological, it's self referential. The important question is not to get into the intricacies of German idealism and be bogged down in their logical sparring. That would be a waste of time. The important thing is the psychological analysis of the people who engaged in this logical game, right? Not to play a game, but to play a different game. And to ask why, not how. Not how do minds come up with their synthetic judgments a priori. Not how we ascertain objective knowledge of reality. This is to be, led astray by the Pied Piper. This is to be dragged down by the Sphinx, to be tricked into asking all these unimportant questions and ask the real question, which is why? Why do you need to believe that you have an interaction with objective reality? And the conclusion is, surprisingly, because it's good for life, that it's essential for life to believe that you have some kind of apprehension of the objective, of the real, some interaction with God. You need that in order to live. And so the entire, it's almost like children playing in the schoolyard of German philosophy. They're all in the sandbox, throwing sand at each other, debating whether the absolute and the particular are ever united or they're not united. And you're reading the phenomenology of spirit, and you're cracking your skull open on the logical bypaths of Hegel. Why are you doing that? And he says, well, but it's because they needed faith. They needed faith the way that Christians needed the New Testament, the way that the Jews needed the Old Testament, the way that every human being ever needs faith. And in youth, you're too young to know that your faith is not substantiated by itself. It's substantiated by the need for itself, because you can't survive without faith. And so all these people, especially as a remedy, as you were saying, for the French modernists, but also the English modernists, right? This very skeptical, empirically oriented, some would say immoral, but certainly immoralists. The Germans needed some kind of antidote for this French English modernity that was coming into Germany. And their philosophy, which aspired to attain the objective truth, was this antidote. And as you said, it lasted less than a century and came apart, which is definitely something a cautionary tale for the rest of us. One thing I am interested in asking you, I don't know that I have an opinion of this on this as of yet, but do you think that this end of German philosophy, of the golden age of German philosophy, do you think that Nietzsche was a symptom or a cause of it? Is it possible that if Nietzsche had not been born, or he had died in the war, or he I don't know, had gotten married or something like this, and was diverted from spending his life being the malignant Socratic vampire on the edges of German civilization and undermining all the faith in these idealistic reveries, would the system have collapsed anyway? Or was it really he who poisoned the well, dealt the killing blow, and made it impossible because he made a mockery of it?
I think there's a lot of evidence that Nietzsche was not exactly the cause of it. And I look to three things. One of them is Nietzsche was not popular in his lifetime. And he was the first of the philosophers, so to speak, to live on his principles and abandon academia, although he had a very good academic position very young. I guess he was your age, actually. He thought it was over, but there was nothing he could do about it, so he just went his own way. But he didn't have the kind of popularity that could affect things. The second thing is that the influence of Nietzsche came through philosophers who read him, and it was, say, people like Max Weber. And so it came out much later. In his lifetime, he had very little influence, if any. Most of his books didn't sell. Most of the sales petered out. And he was in no position to be custodian of his legacy either, since he went mad in 89. So very short activity and very ignored. That's the thing. Nietzsche, in a sense, is the most obviously philosophical philosopher in modern times because he had almost no influence in his lifetime. This was very rare compared to, again, Kant was the most celebrated figure in Germany. You could say that the way in which Nietzsche presents himself here in relation to Kant is sort of like the way he presented Epicurus in relation to Plato in the earlier aphorisms. And the third bit of evidence has to do with what Nietzsche himself says here. He says, look at how things fell apart. He didn't do this. It was falling apart before he did. Hegelianism had fallen apart before he was born, and Neo-Kantianism didn't lead anywhere. They couldn't achieve anything with all of the resources of the enormously prosperous German academia. And that's sort of like American academia now. These people can achieve nothing, and they have more talent to sacrifice and more money to burn than anybody has ever thought possible. And the achievement is nothing. Now, saying, oh my God, these people are collapsing, these people are going to hell, might help it on, might make things worse. Nietzsche certainly wants to do that to accelerate the collapse, but he didn't cause it. So I think the question is slightly to the side of that. It's, to what extent does he think he can affect it? The major motion of modern materialism and skepticism and subjectivism, he thinks he can meld these things into a new philosophy, but he didn't come up with these things. They're just how modern thought works. Radicalizing modern science presupposes modern science. He didn't come up with that either. So he's self-consciously a next step and a kind of bridge to the future. But the necessity for that bridge is also not something of his own making. Nietzsche can appeal and has appealed since his day to more and more people precisely because in the backs of their minds, people no longer believe in enlightenment. They no longer believe in the achievements of Kant or of modern natural science or something like that. And the realization that not even the scientists are impressive anymore is you could say, the last nail in the coffin of positivism, of modern science, of this sort of attempt to take matter into motion and through the model study of that mathematically to solve the human problems. And and part of the point here is that Nietzsche is already part of a tradition, not just of modern philosophers who rebel against previous philosophy, but modern philosophers who are dissatisfied with modern philosophy. The moralization of modern philosophy that started at the end of the 18th century was one such moment. It was clear that the materialism of the 17th and 18th centuries was simply not enough. You can't, on the basis of Hobbes, really describe human affairs very well. Hegel is a much more sophisticated Hobbes, but it's not clear that it's any different after. And so the dissatisfaction leads to new solutions that lead to a renewed and maybe radicalized dissatisfaction. And by the time of Nietzsche and Heidegger, they're indicting all of modern philosophy, but also all of philosophy since Plato. And the problem just gets worse and worse. But clearly, since these people didn't have that much influence, the world catastrophe is independent of that. It's clearly caused by philosophy, but strangely enough, not by the philosophers who get the blame for it. They didn't make this happen. They were just the first to be crazy enough to say it. Look at things falling apart around you. And of course, since people didn't want the catastrophe, but they were very proud of the enlightenment that provoked it, it was much easier to blame the first people who say the Enlightenment is the problem. And again, Nietzsche is not the first guy to say that. This is how Rousseau became a celebrity. The first discourse in the 1751, something like that, so a good century before Nietzsche went to school, says the arts and sciences are killing us. They're just creating all of these, arrogant bourgeois people who have absolutely no patriotism and are incapable even of understanding that they're taking away their own dignity. The more they make life profitable, the more they're successful, the less do they have any humanity to brag about. That it was the first, you could say, radical criticism of the success of modern Anglo commercial liberal modernity. And since things were radicalized by saying that maybe it's not just that this is that the arts and sciences are immoral, they might not even be science after all. They might not even understand the problem of knowledge. And that is the tendency as a whole of German thought. You could say, leave Nietzsche aside as a whole. The great philosopher then is Husserl. And Husserl also says that there's something about these German philosophers and their idea of how you acquire science that is nutty, because it implies a safe position of experience, of a natural apprehension that you cannot take for granted. You have to return to the phenomena. And of course, Husserl ends his career with the crisis of Western science. Now, nobody ever accused Husserl of radicalism. He was the most decent, academic, stolid fellow. But whether you look at the crisis of Western science or the Cartesian meditations, all of it is asking what happened to this kind of rationalism. It broke down of itself. Enlightenment is a trap.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that was a very convincing argument. One of the key clues here is his reference of Realpolitik, which you mentioned is probably a reference to Bismarck. And Nietzsche doesn't get into it too deeply here, and in general, not so deeply in Beyond Good and Evil. There are some sections later in the book. But in his earlier works, the Untimely Meditations, for example, he's very clear that in his view, nationalism and statism are totally barbarizing the culture. This is one of the key, whenever you hear somebody talking about Nietzsche, one of the key clues that they have not read him and don't know what they're talking about is if they associated him either with statism or with nationalism, which happens far more often than you think. And every time you hear it, you have to think, this person has no idea what they're talking about. So yeah, I think you're right that in a sense he's looking around Prussia and saying this is a barbarization of German culture. We're not going in the right direction. In fact, we're going in the wrong direction. We are our our modernization is actually making us less rather than more, which is perhaps why he's so preoccupied with that problem in this book. Aphorism 12. As for materialistic atomism, it is one of the best refuted theories there are. And in Europe, perhaps no one in the learned world is now so unscholarly as to attach serious significance to it, except for convenient household use, as an abbreviation of the means of expression. Thanks chiefly to the Dalmatian Boscovich, he and the Pole Copernicus have been the greatest and most successful opponents of visual evidence so far. For while Copernicus has persuaded us to believe, contrary to all the senses, that the earth does not stand fast, Boscovich has taught us to abjure the belief in the last part of the earth that stood fast, the belief in substance, in matter, in the earth residuum and the particle atom. It is the greatest triumph over the senses that has been gained on earth so far.
So here you see a couple of things that started this section. Suspicion of the earth is suspicion of the body. The question is, does the earth stand fast, or is it in fact moving, but I can't feel it because my body is deceiving me, or is just failing to grasp what is really going on? That's where the modern anti-rationalists in section 10 started. But where does it come from? It comes way back of them from the rationalists themselves. Boscovich, who is, I guess, largely forgotten, is not part of the great canon of modern scientists, unlike, say, Copernicus or Galileo, right, who are still famous, was like Copernicus, kind of a priestly, monkish figure. He was a Jesuit, but an immensely learned guy, what people call a Renaissance man or a polymath. He worked on everything from public projects in engineering in Italy and Vienna as well. And he's from Dalmatia, as he says, from what was then, I think, still the Republic of Ragusa, part of the Venetian Empire, and is now in Croatia, called Dubrovnik. Beautiful city. So he moved around the Italian-Austrian world, but he was also a fellow of the Royal Society as a foreigner. So part of the modern scientific project, and he made important astronomical observations. People might still study some of those things, but they just don't care that it's Boscovich. He's not as famous as Newton. And the work that Nietzsche is concerned with has to do with atomism, but especially with the notion of Boscovich that you shouldn't think about the atomism matter. You should think about it as the center of a force field. And of course, that is part of the tendency of modern physics. And again, it's a very interesting reversal to observe that modern science started with matter in motion and has ended up with mere force fields and a kind of mysticism of string theory. That matter has dissolved, so to speak, into science is a very interesting version of, if you will, the victory of mind over matter. We started with thinking, physics is serious. You can run experiments, you can change the world, you can go out in the cosmos. But it might end out instead meaning that all there is math. It's like string theory. Your emperor not so much of the universe as of numbers. And Boscovich is part of that transformation of thought of how Copernican Newtonian physics turns into force fields. And then even the last part of matter, the atom, vanishes. The consequences for thought are much more important than Boscovich, whom apparently only Nietzsche ever cared about. He had his moment in the scientific transformation of modernity in the 18th century, but since has been forgotten. But Nietzsche cared about this stuff, read this book. There are some fragments he wrote earlier in his career in the 1870s. And so he drags him out again here in 1885 towards the end of his career, because he's interested in this particular problem, what it would mean to get rid of materialistic atomism and therefore to rethink matter and force people to face where do they stand on this. Is matter real? What is matter really, if it is real? And if they will not hold on to an atom, then they must admit that what is at stake is forces, and therefore that there is a strange kinship between the will and modern science. That is, there might be a way, Nietzsche is certainly looking for a way to reconnect philosophy to the world, but you would have to wipe out all the vestiges, both of modern science, but specifically its metaphysical residues. And then you would be able to confront the world anew without all the assumption that things are categorized, that the beings are classified by the intellect, and you're pretty much safe out there. When you realize you are not safe out there, that it's crazy, then you can begin to think about the possible connection between the cosmos and man, if you will, on a kind of Heraclitean basis. That is, war is king of all and father of all. As king, war or conflict or strife is the regulative principle. There's It's not quite chaos, but it's certainly not the cosmos. It's war. But as father, it is also fertile or generative and maybe even providential for his sons, so to speak. There might be a way to think about the craziness of being human in relation to the craziness of the cosmos or the chaos, and see the connection, and therefore it would be possible to be human again. It would be possible, that is to say, to connect inner experience and outer experience.
Yeah, his use of Boscovich and Copernicus is not so different from his use of Kant in the sense that he's not going into the debates. Why is materialist atomism impossible? Um, how can we prove that really the sun revolves around the earth? Well, the earth revolves around the sun and not the sun around the earth. He's doing a psychological analysis of what must have happened in these people's minds to make possible the scientific discoveries which they are known for. And in the Copernicus example, it's very illuminating. I think most people today find the notion that someone would believe that the sun went around the earth to be ludicrous. They think it's laughable. So what do you mean you think that the earth goes around the sun? That's preposterous. That is such a stupid thing to believe. When of course it's exactly the other way around. Believing that the earth goes around the sun is absolutely ridiculous. You wake up in the morning and you see the sun come up and you see it go up in an arc in the sky and come down on the other side, and then it goes underneath the earth and then comes up the other side again. So the empirical evidence is all screaming that the sun goes around the earth. You have to be an absolute madman to believe that the earth goes around the sun, or you have to be so utterly indoctrinated, right? You just have to be so completely unreflective in your brain that you just believe what other people tell you. And other people have alleged that really there's this secret conspiracy and really the earth is going around the sun. Of course, you can't see it, and none of your senses show that. And as you were saying, that the earth does not move. You feel it not moving every day. Every moment that you're walking around, it's not moving. But you have to insist that your senses are all lying to you. It's all an illusion, right? It's all Maya. It's all distraction. And really behind all these appearances, there's some objective world in which the sun is not moving, even though your eyes clearly show that it is, and the earth is moving, even though your feet clearly demonstrate that it doesn't, right? So it's this massive conquering, overcoming, overpowering of the senses for the sake of some theory or concept which appropriates, displaces all of the empirical data to come up with a new theory. Now, of course, today we can send cameras up into space and we can see the sun and the moon together. And so it kind of changes things a little bit. But they didn't have that back then, right? Like when these debates were actually happening, when these people discovered that the earth goes around the sun, they did not have cameras that could show them the images of the earth going around the sun. And so there is some radical overcoming of the senses. And it's the same thing with matter, as you were pointing out. You feel the objects are solid, right? And you say, well, okay, let's say that we are willing to believe that objects aren't real and that really they're made up of atoms and that they only look real to me, but really underneath it's just atoms. Okay, fine, I will go with you that far. But then Boscovich shows up and he says, no, it's not just that objects aren't real. All matter isn't real. There is no such a thing as matter. It's just force in motion. And you say, well, that's insanity. What do you mean it's force in motion? Like I put my hand on it. I feel it. It's right there. I can taste it. I can smell it. I can touch it. I can see it. I can hear it. And Boscovich says, no, all of your senses are lying. They're lying to you. They're deceiving you. And you need to overcome them. You need to conquer them. You need to contextualize them. You need to come up with some theory that explains them, even though they're screaming that they're self-evident, right? And so Nietzsche is not as, I mean, he was himself very interested in all these scientific discoveries, But he's not so much interested in these particular scientific truths as much as he is in the psychological transformation which makes these truths possible. And he says what he's saying, we're going to about to get into the next section, is that this is what's required, right? This kind of overcoming of the stimulus, overcoming of the data, overcoming of the concepts, a rearrangement. That's what allows for scientific discovery, and that's what's also going to be necessary for in the moral field, in the moral sphere. One must, however, go still further, he says, and also declare war, relentless war unto death, against the atomistic need, which still leads a dangerous afterlife in places where no one suspects it. Just like the more celebrated metaphysical need, one must also, first of all, give the finishing stroke to that other and more calamitous atomism which Christianity has taught best and longest, the soul atomism. Let it be permitted to designate by this expression the belief which regards the soul as something indestructible, eternal, indivisible, as a monad, as an atomon, that is a non-divisible. This belief ought to be expelled from the sciences. Between ourselves, it is not at all necessary to get rid of the soul at the same time, and thus to renounce one of the most ancient and venerable hypotheses, as happens frequently to clumsy naturalists who can hardly touch on the soul without immediately losing it. But the way is open for new versions and refinements of the soul hypothesis. And such conceptions as mortal soul, and soul as subjective multiplicity, and soul as the social structure of the drives and affects, want henceforth to have citizens' rights in science. When the new psychologist puts an end to the superstitions which have so far flourished with almost tropical luxuriance around the idea of the soul, he practically exiles himself into a new desert and a new suspicion. It is possible that the older psychologists had a merrier and more comfortable time of it. Eventually, however, he finds that precisely thereby he also condemns himself to invention and, who knows, perhaps to discovery.
Yeah, so here you see as you were saying, why Nietzsche is so excited about radicalizing science. There may be something on the other side of this problem. People are stuck in their minds. You could have sort of, like the scientist who does all of his science that tells him none of this is real. Now, what is it like if somebody wants to punch him? These people are notoriously cowardly. All of a sudden, I don't think they would take a scientific view of the matter. In fact, they would think that the body is very real after all. All of the liberal atheists are super involved in keeping themselves healthy. Turns out the body is very important. Something that they believe does not exist and which is not themselves, right? In the modern world, people speak about their bodies in the third person. Somehow it's like, my body is this and my body is doing that and not doing this and it's like this and like that, as though it were foreign to them. And yet they're so obsessed with it. And so somehow it's like we teach kids, hey, don't believe your lying eyes. Actually, you are spinning right now around the sun just very slowly. We force ourselves into this stuff. There's no way out of it. It's the suffering and the tension of the spirit necessary for enlightenment. And as you say, it's what encourages Nietzsche to think we've come this far. Think how much farther we could go. We've already done the crazy thing. Now we just have to draw the consequences. Just listen to what I'm saying. And there's a lot of truth to what he's saying. We have gone down this path. What now? And as you're suggesting, why do people believe otherwise now? Primarily because of technology. What has that done to life, though? Again, there's always a way to second guess your eyes through the camera. There's always a way to refer to an authority that is outside of yourself, that you perceive as inside of yourself. Like everybody's already a cyborg at this point without realizing it. All the tech is there all around you all the time, and you wouldn't be yourself without it. What have we done? So that's part of Nietzsche's point, that all of this is happening. All of these transformations are affecting how people think, what they think about, what they can find attractive or persuasive, what scares them, what everything moral and emotional, not just the facts or the tools. So in fact, it's not science, tech is just a tool. No, it's not. It's the education, the discipline of the spirit that you have to force on every child, not an option. You could be an atheist or a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim or whatever, but you have to be a scientist. That one is not negotiable. That spiritual discipline absolutely imposed on every child under pain of law. The state is there to insist on it. The state wouldn't survive without it. We can't go back on this. We have, gone on this adventure. And if we have, however, we would have to have something better to offer than to say, look, when you're afraid for your life, remember that you have a body, and otherwise pretend it's not there. Be all about the objective perspective or perspectiveless objectivity even. And then, remember to be a well-adjusted liberal. And if your well-adjusted liberalism isn't so well-adjusted, then you go to therapy, in which you'll have something like Christian confession, but without all the religious drama. That does not make sense. That does not add up to a way of life, that it does not add up to humanity or to society or the state or whatever you want to call this, a culture in the case of Nietzsche. And it doesn't add up to a cosmos either. It's patchwork. It's diluted. When once you start looking at it, there are so many goddamned holes. You wonder, how do people get through the day? And it turns out primarily by not noticing. And this is what Nietzsche insists on. What has this done to your soul? Why do you think people are this way now? It might be what we're doing. It might be our enlightenment. You can't claim so much power for enlightenment, for progress, and then disclaim the bad consequences. Like enlightenment is like a medicine, but at the end of the ad or in the papers that tell you what the medicine is all about, there's no disclaimer for some of the adverse conditions, some of the side effects that might follow from taking this pill. Well, there's a lot of side effects. The crisis of civilization is really the side effect. And Nietzsche says, well, if you see the one part and if you see the other part, and if you're willing to connect what came before with what is coming now, then think this through and see that we're sort of stuck. We haven't arrived yet. We're stuck somewhere, and we have to get ourselves going. We have to recover the will to enlightenment and radicalize it. It is necessary to get rid of that thinking about soul that every liberal presupposes when he opens up his magazine and reads a very sympathetic report, a human interest story, the story of some victim somewhere whose interiority is vouchsafed by the art of writing of the New York Times or some shit like that. Get rid of it. Think about it more in the terms of modern science. What if the soul is also mortal? If Leviathan is a mortal god, why not have a mortal soul to boot? Why can't the soul be subjective multiplicity? You don't have to pretend there's a you all the time. It can be, like the liberal fantasy with psychopaths. They have multiple personality disorder. You have multiple personality disorder. Everybody has multiple personality disorder. There is no alternative. It doesn't have to come as a horror to you. This could just be, this is how we think about the psyche now. What about the drives that you somehow perceive in yourself and you try to arrange somehow to give an account of yourself or just to get through the day? All the endless talk you have with yourself or the harassment of some part of yourself that goes against some other part of yourself that makes you talk about your body in the third person. What if it's all you and is the only you there is? If you have taken the path of enlightenment, you have to go past that bien-pensant liberalism and embrace the theory of drives. You have to embrace thinking about the affects. Why are you feeling this way? What is the thought that is associated with that feeling? How is this making you human? And therefore to say that the supposition of the ego in psychology, of the soul in religion, that's the problem. What you call the disorder is not the problem. That's you. And you have to think of yourself in such a way that you are no longer a disorder. And that, therefore, would require a new psychology. And that would require banishing oneself into the desert, out of the luxuriance. Get away from all of the nonsense, all of the traditions, or what is now called the DSM, or best practices, or the secondary literature, or what the studies show. You would need to face this crazy stuff with honesty and seriousness and focus. And on that basis, you'd have to get to invention and then maybe discovery. But crucially, the discovery, or whatever happy end you think there might be, is not guaranteed. You don't know. It's not like when they give you the textbook. It's not like when they give you the TED talk. It's not like when they tell you what studies show. You can't start with the conclusion or with the confidence that the conclusion will be there and it'll be fine. It'll be nice. It'll feel good. Maybe it won't. The the only reality is the desert. All good things are on the other side of victory. But but the reality then is the strife. And if you get to victory, we'll see about that later. This is the perspective that Nietzsche wants to recover. And that's why, in a way, he admires the earlier uh, Enlightenment, because they were crazy, radical people. They turned the world upside down, for starters. And he wants to recover that ambition. Ante up. You have to go farther. This is not the end of the modern adventure. The, the postmodernity of Nietzsche is reflecting on modernity as this adventure, but he's not trying to sidetrack it. He's only trying to give it its full scope. And part of that is affecting the Copernican revolution that Kant talks about in the um, preface to the first critique, but not letting it go at saying this is the structure of intellect. It says, no, you should think about the structure of soul. It is a more comprehensive thing. It is not enough to say, what is the idea of freedom and how does it guide morality? You should say, what is the will? How is there any unity to being human? And here, again, for a moment, he reminds you that there's something world historical about this, that you should be thinking also about the ancient and the venerable, the love of the ancestral, the soul. It's a hypothesis, it's a postmodern reading of tradition, but it's worthy. It's very important. You can't simply throw it away. Only the clumsy naturalist does that, who doesn't really know nature. The human nature isn't such an object that even the clumsy can grasp. Again, if truth is a woman, she does not like the clumsy. The point is that something about that ancient hypothesis is important because it did not, at step one, do away with being human. The step one of radical scientific skepticism that builds the step two of scientific dogmatism that we teach then in schools at step three, that step one of skepticism does away with being human. Nietzsche is fine with the materialism and the subjectivism, but only with so much of the skepticism. He would rather be more skeptical of these skeptics themselves. He would rather be more skeptical of their will to truth than of the basic notion that we are living beings and we have to give an account of ourselves in terms of life also.
Yeah. It's such a powerful argument. He's suggesting that the um the scientific revolution which overcame the senses uh could be replicated also in morality, right? So he was criticizing German idealism in the previous aphorism, but he's not criticizing them from the perspective of an empiricist. He's not saying we need to go back to empirical experience. He says we haven't gone far enough. And of course, Kant allows for faith in the soul as part of his moral theory. What is this faith in the soul? Well, actually, it's a kind of empirical experience. Hegel begins his phenomenology of spirit with the I experience. You know, that is the most fundamental experience to Hegel. There is an experience, and I am experiencing it. Right. So there is an empirical element to this, where human beings feel that there is an I. Like there is this sensation that I exist, and like you said, you might be this kind of naturalist who will go about saying yes, well there is no ego, but the second that it's your money or your woman or your job, then all of a sudden the I comes right back, right? And there's a faith in this I. It's a very old faith. It's an old Christian faith that there is such a thing as a soul. And there are a lot of questions that are not asked about this. And I find this is still very much the case today. I feel like we have made very little progress on this. People assume that who they were yesterday is who they are tomorrow. They just assume that this is the same person, or that they want something, or that the things that they want somehow cohere into like a cohesive whole, rather than being a different set of desires that cannot be made to cohere. Or they believe that what they want is in some way logical or rational, or they could explain it, or that they even know what they want. That there is actually some kind of overlapping between what they think they want and what they want. And these are all just assumptions, highly dubious assumptions. And they come from this, the lying of the eyes, that you walk through your daily experience and you sense the I, and you go from there to assuming that there is an I, and that the I is coherent, and that it is never changing. And then even if you are religious, then you will even say that it's immortal, that it is independent of the body, or at least does not die with the body. And Nietzsche says we have to overcome this empirical blindness. It's not a blindness to empirical data. It's a blindness caused by empirical data. And he may be importing Buddhism here. This might be through Schopenhauer. Depends how you want to interpret it. But nevertheless, he's saying if we were to take seriously this scientific movement of theorizing about forces, it would not be sufficient to just do it with the sun and do it with the particles in the table in front of you. You would have to take yourself to be a matrix of forces, an intersection of different wills. And so there is no way to think of yourself as an atom, as a non-divisible, as a single coherent whole, right? So a different kind of psychology is necessary, not a psychology which tries to treat the individual as an individual. What does individual mean? It means something that's not divided, right? That's exactly the problem. You need to think of yourself as divisible, as a realm or an arena, as you were saying, of competition, of all these different wants, of all these different drives, of all these different affects. And perhaps they're all you, or perhaps none of them are you. This word you itself needs to be regrammaticized. It needs to find a new place in a new language. And of course, that will put you in a desert. It's interesting that you were saying that it's a kind of personal desert, that thinking of yourself this way will radically change the world in which you live, that you won't necessarily know. When you feel that you want something, you will immediately ask yourself, who is it in me who wants this? Which part of me wants this? Is it a good part, a bad part, a high part, a low part? Does it cohere with the other things that I want? These questions cannot be answered when you assume that I or you are atoms, are indivisibles, are individuals. So, in a sense, you're putting yourself into this wilderness. But there's also the simple scientific side of it, which is that from where Nietzsche is standing, I mean, I think the realm of psychology has played at times with this. You can see Freud and Jung are obviously playing with these concepts themselves, right? So there are people who went in this direction, but it's to leave behind essentially thousands of years of prejudice about what it means to be a human being with a mind, with a personality, with a character, and think of yourself in an absolutely new way, which Nietzsche says himself, I don't know if we're discovering or inventing. Perhaps this is the way things really are, and we are uncovering the mistakes that everybody has made before. Or maybe this is a new kind of human being in a new world, that reality itself has shattered us, has warped our psychology, that it is not whole anymore. Either way is certainly the case that it is not possible to go back. So if we were to want to revolutionize morals the way that we revolutionize sciences, it would be completely unacceptable to do what Kant did and try to fit the old morality with the new science as if they work together when they're not. It's a Frankenstein's monster. And so instead, we would have to do to morality what we did to science, which is we need to overcome the prejudices, the assumptions that we have. And the most fundamental assumption is that I exist as a coherent whole, as a logical, understandable, readily apparent, readily available to the senses object. And he says, well, you need to be less naive about this object. And we're going to do a lot of exploring of it in later aphorisms.
Yeah. And I think we can stop here for today with this criticism of modern science that follows the criticism of ancient science. And in the next round, we'll look to this possibility. Okay, if we follow down Nietzsche's path and you have to have a new psychology and a new physiology, what would that look like? And what kind of analysis does that conduct in order to make sense of a bewildering experience, let's call it? But that's for the next time. Hadar, this was very good.
My pleasure.
Glad we're already through the middle of the first chapter. And in a few more rounds, we'll get through all of this chapter and therefore lay out. If you look through the prejudices of the philosophers, if you attack this tradition, what is revealed? Not so much what is destroyed, what is revealed? How do you begin to see the problem of being human again if you don't take all the answers for granted? If you come alive to them, what possibilities stand out, and how are you going to conduct your analysis of which possibilities are likeliest or most promising? And therefore already see what is Nietzsche's positive project? What is he trying to contribute here? So all the best until next time.
Until next time, my friend.